who's appeared before our committee since February 14, has talked about the need for increased technical assistance to developing countries. And along this line, I've been working, in fact, lately with Congressman Graham Purcell on what we call, for lack of a better name, a bread and butter corps, where we'd work through our land-grant colleges in an effort to provide technical assistance. We think there will be a technical assistance amendment added, and of course are hopeful that we can get our amendment tacked on. I don't know if you've had any chance to review anything along this line or not, but would appreciate your comment if you have any.
Well, I certainly agree with your thought that it's necessary to have a program of technical assistance. Now, we can supply more food to the backward countries as we go along, but as the rate population is increasing, it will never be possible for this country to produce enough food, and I don't think we should do it because if it's handled properly, many of these countries can expand and develop their agriculture and produce more for themselves, which of course is the thing which is best for them and best for us.
Welcome to Club Eisenhower. I'm your host, Joy Murphy. Here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library, our 2024 programs are all focused around the central theme of waging peace. Throughout the year, we will conduct an in-depth study of the many ways that President Eisenhower worked to bring about a global peace. This month, we are looking at the Food for Peace program. Now, before we can get into the Food for Peace program, we want to start with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan comes after World War II, where most of Europe is pretty devastated. And so there needs to be a plan for economic recovery. So President Truman signs this Marshall Plan in 1948. And what it really does is, part of it is to provide food for all of these countries who are struggling with famine. But there are concerns about the Soviet Union, right? They have a full stronghold on Eastern Europe, and there are concerns that because of the weakened state of most of Europe, that they will be able to spread out to Western Europe. So this isn't just about being a good humanitarian. It is also about being concerned about the spread of communism. And we are eventually kind of looking at an impending Cold War. But, this is just, they're looking at this concern about the possible spread of communism. So with that said, we are going to look at the evolution of the Marshall Plan into what would eventually be called the Food for Peace program. And with that, we welcome
Dr. Jim Ginther. I'm the supervisory archivist for the Eisenhower Presidential Library.
All right, welcome.
Thank you.
We have quite a few documents in our collection here at the Eisenhower. So you brought a few that kind of introduces this program.
I did, yeah. And it's interesting, Joy, you mentioned the sort of this complex environment in which Food for Peace is developing in. And that's something that from the beginning in the documentation is evident. The origins of the program sort of emerge out of a report that's put together by John Davis, who was a former Secretary of Agriculture, at the behest of the State Department, looking for a way to use U.S. farm surpluses to better serve American foreign policy. So from the very beginning, these two ideas of both American foreign policy and U.S. foreign policy are linked together in Food for Peace from the very beginning. And one of the things that is also recognized from the very beginning is that this kind of a program is probably going to have an image problem. How does it look around the world? There's advantages, several of which are listed in this early report on Food for Peace. Talking about how it gives the U.S. a chance to sort of use agriculture as a means of countering Soviet foreign policy, as you mentioned before, and also that it would raise the living levels of the free world, and also make it possible to deal with this problem of large U.S. farm surpluses after the war. essentially, as this study quotes, to use our abundance in the cause of peace. However, there are some disadvantages to the program as well that they recognize. One of the problems is we don't want to create a permanent dependence on U.S. food supplies to feed nations. We don't want to make U.S. farmers dependent on a government program to increase prices within the farm economy of the United States. We also know that to change some of that around, we need to buy time to update farm legislation in the United States. And there is also the worry of the perception of, are we simply trading food to curry favor with nations around the world? And the problem of, are we feeding only our friends and maybe not those so friendly? Maybe we're not as humanitarian as we would like to perceive. So all of those are recognized sort of from the very beginning in trying to develop the Food for Peace program.
So we have all these concerns, right? But, a part of that is that we also have, President Eisenhower, right, who was also Ike the soldier. And so he has fought in this war. He has seen everything that has happened. He understands probably better than most, right, that, these countries are struggling. He has been a part of, at this point, the creation of SHAFE. And, so he's not just our president, right? He's been this kind of global leader, global presence. So he understands all of these things are going on. So even with all of these disadvantages, is he looking and going, but still this needs to be done?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And I think that from the very beginning, there's a perceived need. The real question is how to present that to a world in a way so that we accomplish our goals without the possible negative perceptions of the program. And I think that's part of why I chooses to make this more of an international effort. Shortly after initiating the program, he calls a conference to involve international partners, other nations who are producing food surpluses, but also other nations that will have need of these food surpluses to feed their populations. He wants to bring those folks together into a global effort. The idea of using food for peaceful means to accomplish peaceful purposes, very similar to what's being done earlier with the Atoms for Peace program. The idea of using atomic energy, atomic technology, scientific know-how to promote peaceful uses of nuclear energy. Similar kind of idea here, using farm surpluses to promote a greater good around the world, but in terms of an international partnership, not just a one-sided sort of solo effort by the United States.
I'm glad you brought up Atoms for Peace because, again, Ike the soldier, we have this quote in our museum. He says, "I hate war as only a soldier can," right? Ike the soldier is very adamant about this idea of a global peace and finding different ways. So this is kind of what we're studying for this whole year, is this waging peace idea. But everyone's not on board with it, right? And maybe that's everybody's different backgrounds. They don't necessarily understand, but this idea of bringing the world into it, and it's not just the responsibility of America, but at the same time, it's not even him saying it's only the responsibility of America. I think he recognizes that if the world is not involved with this, if it's not a partnership, that it may not be successful. So I'm going to say thank you, Jim.
Sure.
We are actually going to move into talking about the evolution of the Food for Peace program, what it becomes, some of the concerns and fears. We'll talk about those a little bit more in depth. We've talked about, the establishment of this program, right? And what is actually Public Law 480, which becomes the Food for Peace program, and the goals of it. But now we're looking at an evolution, right? And so with that, we are bringing in
Sarah Gard, and I am the Senior Archivist and Head of Collections at the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics at the University of Kansas.
All right. And so we know that the Food for Peace program was almost the baby of Senator Dole, right? He really loved this program. He's really a big supporter of it. First of all, how does he become involved with it, and what does it mean for him?
Sure. So Senator Dole, well, actually, we come to this as then Congressman Dole, from our wonderful agriculturally rich state of Kansas. Agriculture, food, nutrition was important to him from the beginning of his tenure in Congress. So his major involvement with Food for Peace sort of begins, and we see in our collections about 1965, 1966 as the Food for Peace PL 480 is coming up for renewal in 1966. And he was, of course, supportive, and he inserted an amendment to this to create a program that he called the Bread and Butter Corps. And this would be, he envisioned it to be farmers, educators from the United States who would travel to countries to help teach them technical skills needed to grow and sustain crops in their country. He thought that this could be like coordinated within the government, the USDA, and that would be carried out through land grant colleges, farm groups, private groups. And it did become part of the bill or the reauthorization in 1966, and it was renamed Farmer to Farmer. And so that's sort of where this idea was like really important to him, and it carries on throughout the years.
Okay, so we're going to get a little bit more in depth about this evolution and kind of what it does for Kansas farmers and globally what it does. But before we get into that, with Dr. Ginther and these early documents that we have, we talk about how there's concern that some of these countries will become dependent. You know, they won't ever get their own self-sufficiency, right? And in this clip that we heard at the beginning of the show, it is Congressman Dole?
Congressman Dole.
Okay, he's still Congressman.
Yes.
And he is talking to Congressman Hope.
Yeah, former congressman, I think, at that point.
Okay, former Congressman Hope, about this program. And one of the things that Congressman Hope states as a concern is that some of these countries will be dependent, right? So this is an ongoing conversation, and we're going to pause right there because he does use a word. He calls the countries backwards. That word is problematic for a lot of reasons. For that time, I think it was considered an appropriate word. We are not in any sort of way feeling like these countries are backwards. What's the right word?
Well, I mean, they're just countries.
They're just countries. Mm-hmm. That's true. They're
right.
countries, and I also think that a word like backwards doesn't take into account a lot of the things that have happened, like colonization. And though this is probably not the appropriate venue to talk about that, we have to think about things like the resources are there, but some of these countries' resources have been mined from them, and so that term backwards is just not something that fully describes all of the things that happens to get a country to, maybe it's not the wealthiest country in the world. We have to think about those things. So, those were his words. So,
It was the 1960s.
Right. We can't change his words.
Yeah.
So that said, what he talks about, though, is this something that was already mentioned in the early documents, is that there is a concern that these countries will never be self-sufficient. So I have to ask, how does Congressman Dole feel about that? Or how does he, or do you know, and how does he propose to address that?
Yeah, I think he is, he's also concerned about becoming reliant on just surpluses. And also as we sort of go forward in time, the program becomes less about surpluses and more just about commodities, because there's not huge surpluses left anymore. That's Dole's intention by starting this bread and butter core, farmer to farmer aspect, which would help to develop this like self-sustaining, self-help aspect of it. And I love that there's quotes that I see throughout, like he always used this terminology, you know, in the 60s, in the 70s, and in the 80s. He said it would export American farm know-how and show how. I'm sure somebody in his office felt very proud for coming up with that rhyming slogan, but I think it's really adequate for describing what they were trying to do.
So I think we do need to back up a little bit, because as Dr. Ginther was saying, that, you know, this had something, also wanted to do something with the surplus to help American farmers, right? So this ends up, you know, really being something that helps American farmers make it, right? It helps them do something with all this food that they've grown. But over the years, it continues to be a support system, right? That's one of the reasons Senator Dole, Congressman Dole, really takes to this program, because it's going to help these farmers here in Kansas, in the Midwest. And so, you know, there's this idea about dependency, and you mentioned it, about them also being dependent on a program like this. However, we're going to bring Dr. V in.
My name is Dr. Vincent Amanobuadu. I'm a professor of agricultural economics and agribusiness at Kansas State University.
Okay, so we're bringing you in because this is more, you know, we're more and more starting to become a global economy, right? You know, this idea of not just a global economy, but this idea of just really globally moving food around, right? We're looking at it, if we're looking at it now in 2023, you know, we get our avocados from Mexico. We get food from all around the world, right? And it moves easily, but that wasn't necessarily the case then.
No, it wasn't. And you have to put it in context that we've just finished a war. Mm-hmm. And, but the good thing that happened, if there was any good thing about the war, was that it didn't happen on U.S. soil. So U.S. production had actually been geared up to feed the war effort. And that's where this whole problem of surplus begins. Because we've geared up to feed the war effort and the war is over, we had these surpluses that are coming from our productive capacity at the time. By the way, American agricultural production still remains the most productive in the world. Our use of resources, when you anchor it in 1948, is virtually flat. And our productivity on production from those resources is still going through the roof. So technology, as then Congressman Dole was talking about, sharing that technology is important. So within that context of, you know, we have this productive capacity, we no longer have the military problems we have, and a president who had actually been in war theater, and as he quotes, and you have referred to it already, hate war, you know, as much as only a soldier can, you know, can see the possibility of using this excess productive capacity to wage peace in a way that nobody else could actually see it. So the politics of putting this policy together, right, is not just foreign, it's also domestic. You know, keep our agricultural producers in business without slumping the market with overproduction, and also build relationships internationally in a way that we could minimize the risk of, you know, the conflicts that could result from a hungry man being an angry man.
Absolutely, because, I mean, that's part of the concept, right? You cannot expect people to concern themselves with peace if they are not getting their basic needs met. I used to be a teacher. I have a degree in education, and one of the things that we talk about when you're an education student is Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which I understand is a little bit outdated now, but still, if you've ever been in a classroom, you can't ask a kid to concentrate on their math if they're starving. That's why we have programs in schools that feed children, right? And so it's the same concept. I'm not going to concern myself with peace when I'm hungry.
Right.
And then there's the idea that a hungry person might do some desperate things too.
Right.
And so, President Eisenhower sees this, right? He also, again, hates war as only a soldier can, and he sees this impending Cold War. Right. He understands, he's a part of this Atoms for Peace, but he knows what can happen, right? He knows what nuclear power can do. Again, he was a soldier.
Right.
And for, Hiroshima and all of that. And so he understands that these things could happen. And so he's trying to fix that, right? Moving forward to Congressman Dole, he's, of course, trying to help his home state. But, the Cold War, the concerns about the Cold War, that's not over with. It's still a problem. There's still a concern about it. But technology is growing. We still have people all over the world who are still hungry. So it's not as if there was even an opportunity, because you said, this conversation is happening as it's time to renew PL 480. Mm-hmm. It's not as if this need has gone away. So I like that Congressman Dole is looking at a bigger way to solve this need, right? So K-State is a land grant college. Mm-hmm. I'm a proud graduate of Florida Agricultural and Mechanical University, also a land grant college that has a very large agricultural program. But I know K-State has a global food systems program, mm-hmm. but I know FAMU does not. And I don't know of course, I don't know every land grant college. I also went to the University of Florida, their land grant college with an agricultural program, but a lot of them are focused on America. So where did we lose that? First of all, that these land grant colleges are not focused on it. And if and then let's talk about K-State's program.
Well, the land grant colleges have not lost sight of it. The very foundation, the reason why the land grant colleges exist is an act of Congress that basically said in every state, we shall have universities that are focused on research and education of our farmers and the training of our leaders. So that has always been the mission of every land grant university. They call it a three-legged stool. There is teaching, research, and extension. And extension is basically taking the university to the people. I have extension appointment, which basically keeps me in the country, talking to farmers, bringing the knowledge that is being generated in the universities into a way that farmers can apply them. And that underscores this rapid growth in U.S. agricultural productivity. So that land grant mission is still there and underscores why, universities like Kansas State University is still in business. If we lose that, we've lost our reason for existence, right? So the global side of it has the universities, the land grant universities have been part of this whole process from the beginning because they were the first to actually see the challenges that the overproductivity resulting from the war was creating, because that's what they do. They do this research. And so policy usually begins in these universities where you're producing reports. Congressional staff are seeing those reports. They are turning it into conversations with Congress people. That is then translated into potential policies. So we are involved in policy making. And a very close friend and professor at Kansas State University, probably the most preeminent agricultural policy scholar this country has seen, is Professor Barry Flinchbaugh, who just passed away a few years ago. And he was extremely involved in these policy-making processes around, the renewal of the translation of the farm support programs from the Food for Peace component into the Farm Bill, which I know we'll talk about later. But those issues are all involved with the land grant institutions participating at the political level actively. I hope that helps.
Yeah. If I can jump in, I think I have I found an interesting constituent letter that I wanted to share that sort of, I think, is maybe some sort of like bridge in here. So I think an important part to point out is that while this farmer to farmer was passed in the legislation, it was not fully funded until 1985. So I think then Congressman Dole, and he becomes Senator Dole and is advocating for these things, is looking for other ways to try and get funding for this piece. But I found this letter, and it is from Vernon Larson, and he is, according to his letter, he's the chief of party for the Kansas State USAID in India. And it's a partnership between Kansas State and an agricultural university in India. And he says, "Dear Senator Bob Dole, greetings from India. The Larson family just arrived here over a month ago, and we're getting adjusted." But he's talking about how Kansas State has a 12-man team here partnering with people from this university to
improve their knowledge.
Yeah. So I thought that was a perfect illustration of what we're talking about and the partnerships that we're doing on this podcast too.
Absolutely. So, that's the conversation we want to have is how does that look? How does it look, these things that Congressman then Senator Dole proposes? How does it look to go out and teach the world these agricultural what's the word?
Technology.
Technology, yes. But how to farm, how to, because certain crops grow better in certain environments, right? Just history tells us, the reason that rice plantations were so big in South Carolina? Yeah, South Carolina is because the land out there, the wetness, and it was prime for rice. So, that like teaching people what are the right crops to grow in your area that you could grow, fairly easily and efficiently, that wouldn't be super expensive for you, but could properly feed your people. All of that is a part of this conversation, right?
Yeah. And I mean, we have to remember that the role, of the United States at this point, at least from the land grant university perspective, which is being implemented through the policy, is to bring the knowledge from the universities to countries that allow them to enhance their own productivity, right? That is still going on. USAID is responsible, and there are components of the bill that, we can look at because they distributed their responsibilities between state and agriculture, for different aspects of it. So USAID is still today spending a lot of resources developing technologies for developing countries to enhance agricultural production. And as you said, there's always conflict. Our job with responsibility to the American farmer is to sell American products. When you enhance productivity, are you creating competitors to the American farmer? And that tension is still there. The argument that is often made is that if you can create a country, if you can enhance the productivity of a country, then you can enhance their consumption power, which then creates the possibility of them consuming American products. So it is possible that, yes, they might produce enough food to feed themselves, but because they are now feeding themselves, they want cars, and then we can ship cars over, right? So that is always been part of the diplomacy component, that we expand freedom, and it's not just political freedom, but also economic freedom to these places. Maybe I can give an anecdote of PL 480. I grew up in Ghana, and I was, boarding schools, and our feeding program was yellow corn, wheat, and milk powder, with the emblazoned, from the American people logo of USAID on those wheat bags. I can still remember them, where, they cook the yellow corn into porridge and put the milk powder in. Sometimes they put too much in it, and then you get diarrhea from it and all that. But it probably contributed to preventing malnutrition for a lot of kids at that period. And some of my, people in my age group and those before me, benefited from that. And I don't think it had an adverse effect on domestic production, even though there are people who see that as stunting domestic production, which was part of the problem that Dr. Jim was talking about, that, they were thinking about it in the process. So I think that, when you look at it from the Eisenhower perspective, and of course it evolves under Kennedy and on, but if you look at it within the Eisenhower lens, the whole issue was, how do we make sure that we don't get this problem of hungry people then generating the possibility for the Soviet Union with its populist views, coming in, because when they're hungry, they become very susceptible. All you have to do is to point to the enemy. It's the capitalist people who are creating this problem for you. So if we can prevent that so that people can think clearly and not become susceptible to propaganda, then we can maintain the free world. And I think that we shouldn't lose sight of this, commitment to global freedom that is embedded in that policy.
Absolutely. I think you brought up something that I don't think that we've talked about, but I do think it's important to point out. You were saying that it was wheat, and that's what you milk and things that you received in Ghana. So I kind of have this guiding question of what is Food for Peace, right? Because it is still an active program. I do want to point that out. But it wasn't this, let's send all kinds of, the food we just love to eat, right? It wasn't tomatoes. It was basics. It was wheat and corn and what else?
Milk. Yep.
It was those kinds of things that I think sometimes as American people, we don't think about, like, how that everyone doesn't have access to these kinds of things. We don't think about how important these things are to nutrition and how these things can help with famine and with malnourishment and things like that. And so I want people to walk away from this understanding that the Food for Peace program was basics. It was basic necessities, again, just to keep people from starving. With that said, I do want us to move forward to this idea of a global economy, and a global food system, right? Because that is what they study at K-State, right? The size of the world has changed, but then again, it's like the size of the world has gotten smaller, right? We can move faster, we can ship things faster, where people didn't travel out of the country as much, 70 years ago. It's not much for people to get on a plane and go somewhere, right? Yeah. Again, food gets shipped around the world now. There are still people starving all around the world because, and Food for Peace is still a program for that reason, right? We're still feeding people around the world. How does a program like this, Food for Peace, and in general, how does feeding a global economy look now? with goods being able to be moved around the world from all around the world, with countries being able to take things that are naturally grown in their country and market that. What does this look like now?
Well, the problem we had in 1954 through the 60s after the war and colonization and all that, it's not the problem we have today. But the remnants of that problem remain. So it's not that, I mean, and I'll talk specifically from the African perspective because that's where I've spent a lot of my work in the last, dozen years or so. It's not that African countries, for example, are unable to produce enough to feed themselves. The infrastructure to get the production from the places where they happen to where they need to be used is where the problem is. If you take the United States and take our beloved Kansas, we have roads connecting every farm to the highway. So as a result, there is no farmer in the state who will produce a grain of wheat that will not get to where it needs to get to, right? If you get to any part of Africa, 30 to 50% of that production is lost because it doesn't get to where it needs to get to. You talked about us not shipping tomatoes. There's a reason why we don't ship tomatoes, right? Because tomatoes spoil. There's a reason why we ship wheat, because wheat can stay for a long time. There's a reason why we don't ship fresh milk, but we ship milk powder, right? Because of shelf life. So after the milk is produced, if you don't get it to where it can be processed within a few hours, it's wasted. And that's the problem we have. The current program we have under USAID and the continuation of some of the Food for Peace components is not solving the infrastructure problem. We are providing technology which basically increases production. But if you increase production, farmers are doing very well, but they still can't get the product to market to where it is being needed, right? So we end up still running into the problem of not having enough to eat, not because there is no food, but the food is wasting. Without the roads, without the manufacturing and processing systems, without the distribution network, without the storage facilities to ensure that happens. And then the logical question is, why are they not building roads? Simple. You have $1 million that can go into health or road or schools. Which one is visible to people? If people are dying because there are no vaccines for a particular disease, that is extremely visible. If food is spoiling in a village, nobody sees that until later, right? And so there's that global issue, which, of course, the participants, including Senator Dole, were worrying about with respect to the optics. Are we going to make them dependent, right? For a government that says, well, USAID is going to organize for us to get a shipload of wheat in here. But if we don't build a school or if we don't build a hospital, that becomes our problem. Well, use the money to build a hospital, and then if the food doesn't happen, we can get it, right? So there is a certain perverse incentive that happens, but I put that on the participants in development, right? Because we can solve the problem, but it requires us to think about looking at the root cause of the problem. I've been told by some officials that say, we are not in the business of building roads. Well, building roads and feeding people are not different businesses, right? Because we produce wheat in the Pacific Northwest, put it on the Colombian Snake River system, float that production to the Gulf, put it on boats, and they are right in the world. And it's cheap. It's not cheap just on the farm, it's cheap on the transportation to get it to the market. Brazil is producing soybean cheaper than we are producing. But we land soybeans in China cheaper than Brazil because our Mississippi system is developed that allow us to get product to the Gulf and put them on boats. Brazil is still driving those productions across the country, right? So we need to look at this from a systems perspective and recognize that the developers of the policy understood it, but then they were in conflict, given the rationale for the developing the policy in the first place, getting rid of U.S. Food production in order to maintain prices in the domestic market.
Well, okay. You just gave us a lot of information, but good information. And it's good information that it explains to us why there is still a Food for Peace program, why it still is needed, and where we have to go with it. And so I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I don't want to close this without actually talking a little bit more about the economy, but from the farm side, because I know that Senator Dole was very big about making sure that farmers got fair prices for their food. But when we talk about economic impact, right, we often look at, like, did these countries get better, right? Were they able to become self-sufficient and be able to grow their own food, and are they economically more sound? And many of them are, but many of them are not, right? But we don't talk about it necessarily from the farmer perspective. Mm-hmm. And so I do want to give a little space for that. I don't know if you just want to take over. Or do you want me to keep asking questions?
Oh, well, let's see. Okay. I think Senator Dole saw an opportunity for this program to be mutually beneficial for farmers receiving fair prices for the things that they were growing, and then to also feed hungry people around the world. I read him saying, this should be used as an instrument to boost market prices, not depress them. And I think this also comes into the point in history where we're no longer dealing with surpluses, but just commodities that are being grown and produced. And so there's also a tension between what is being produced and sold and consumed domestically and what we need here in America and what should be sent around the world. And I think he just wanted to make sure that everyone was getting the best deal and the best outcome. But
and so, to date, billions and billions of dollars and maybe tons and pounds of food have been shipped out, right? And so this has been helpful and had a great impact on the local farmers, on the local economy of the farmers, right? Local farm economy, I guess that's a better way to say it.
I think also speaking to what Dr. V is saying is that Senator Dole would point out that this has a potential to help farmers, people in rural communities, but also through the infrastructure that is needed, also people in urban areas, all kinds of jobs and technology is needed to transfer these
knowledge.
Yeah, the knowledge, the stuff, everything. So I just keep thinking the phrase, a rising tide lifts all boats. Yep. And he just wanted to make sure that everyone was being helped.
Yeah, and I think that's where I kind of wanted to go with it, is that these programs, I'm from a rural part of Florida, so I know what extension offices do. I have a cousin who worked for a local extension office where they taught people how to can food, which was really important. That was her job. And that was really important to local farmers because they canned their food that would get them through the winter. Really important, super important. And so I think I want to just make sure that people understand that this program that President Eisenhower advocated for, that Senator Dole advocated for, wasn't something that only helped these outlier countries that, that isn't America.
No.
This is a program that helped citizens right here in this country, and not just the local, not just the Midwest farmer, right? I'm from the South. It helped us. It helped even just a small farmer who had a garden, or Ida Eisenhower had her own garden that she fed her family from. It helped those kinds of people as well. This program economically didn't just have a global impact. It had an impact on the home front as well.
And we can think about it, Joy. The United States spends the lowest amount of our disposable income on food. Globally, really? Nobody is close. Okay? And it's a result of the policies like this that ensured that farmers have a good return through government managing surplus, right? Just about, 2007, 2008, we had the global food crisis where prices basically went through the roof, and there were riots in India, Egypt, Pakistan when price of wheat becomes extremely high, what happens is bread prices go up, and a lot of people depend on bread or flour-based products, and that can cause a lot of problems. We don't see a lot of that in the United States. And it's not because of any magical thing. It's because we have people who, over the years, have had the forethought to understand the really intricate relationship between farm production, food, peace, and basically freedom. Mm-hmm. And, so I want us to always remember those leaders thinking through these things, and of course, with a massive research behind that, right? So I think, given the changes that have happened, yes, United States has benefited a lot from this policy. The policy wasn't, as we said at the beginning, to help per se. It had the ulterior motive, maintaining domestic prices so that families can continue to live, and also, wage peace with, a world that was hungry at the time, and then preventing that hunger from moving people to the Soviet Union's, enticements, right? And so, I want to give that to the Eisenhower administration for having the foresight to see this. We've translated Food for Peace now into the Farm Bill, which is renewed every 5 years. We are working on it right now. And so the whole Food for Peace component has come under the Farm Bill, to drive it. But the American farmer continues to be extremely productive and subject to all the issues and challenges in the marketplace. And we found a way to ensure that they are no longer getting the support, as people would like to say. Yeah, there are subsidies that come in and all that stuff, but this, and I probably shouldn't say much on that, but it's not like it was in 1954. Even through the 60s. We are now selling product as, Senator Dole, envisages. As a matter of fact, the U.S. agriculture is the only segment in the major sectors of the U.S. economy that is running a surplus in trade. The whole U.S. economy is running a negative trade balance. In other words, we are importing more than we are exporting. U.S. agriculture is running a surplus in trade. We are exporting more than we are importing. Yeah, we import food into the United States, but we are exporting more. And that, I think, is a testament to all the policies that have come to support the system through the supply chain.
Well, that said, just want to kind of wrap this up with what it looks like today, right? So starting back at the Marshall Plan, which was just this idea of supporting these devastated countries after World War II, and moving forward to President Eisenhower, who saw this as a way to bring peace and to combat the spread of communism, which, I mean, we're not a communist state, right? So I'm going to just assume or say that he accomplished his purpose. But moving forward to Senator Dole, who had this idea of supporting local farmers, but also moving the world forward on technology and being able to feed themselves and things like that, to today now, where we have this global economy, this global food system, where countries are able to export, food that they've grown there. Some that are natural, native to their country, but they're able to grow food and export it and boost their economy in that way. So, though the Food for Peace program still exists, as you have pointed out, we still have problems with feeding people around the world rather. The goals of these programs, though, do we feel like they've accomplished as much as they thought they were going to accomplish? These people, we're talking, the Marshall Plan, or Senator Marshall, and President Truman and President Eisenhower and Senator Dole, did we meet what they wanted?
I think so. I think because remember that the food issues we have in the world today are very different from what was motivating these policies in the 1950s, 60s. We don't have the hunger problem that we had post-war. So the Marshall Plan built Europe back. It built Japan back. Those have been solved. So that was a success. Today, through the people-to-people initiative that Senator Dole and others promoted, we have technology that is currently still being, produced and shipped around the world to developing countries. USAID is doing that work efficiently. Kansas State University has 5 of their, 25 USAID innovation labs. And those labs' purpose is to bring university researchers together, partner them with developing country researchers to solve problems in those countries that can be adopted and used. Those countries are shipping agricultural products that they are competitive in producing to the world. So it's been a success. I will not take an iota of anything from the foresight of these leaders thinking through this. Has it been 100% without other issues? No. And that's to be expected, right? But I think if we're going to look at the major success, it's been on the people side, where we've grown domestic farmers to build their technologies and their knowledge in production, which has fed through to all sort of genetic engineering and other things that we sometimes don't even think about as related to the potential for growing food and selling food. But we are not giving food away again unless in emergencies. So there's a drought somewhere or there's war or something. That's when we are shipping food out. Today we sell food and people are able to buy it because the generations before them were fed and they were able to grow, get the knowledge, and now they are using it.
Right. Well, any final words?
Sarah?
I think the one thing that I wanted to share is that I think speaks to everything that we've been talking about is just a quote from a speech that Senator Dole gave celebrating the 30th anniversary of the passing of PL 480. And this whole speech is actually just a wonderful read. So maybe I'll make sure that we can get that out to people. But it says under the heading, A Legacy of Interdependence, and it says, the years would demonstrate that the real legacy of PL 480 came to be the economic interdependence it generated. And I think that also really spoke to me. We've all lived through this global pandemic, which I think just reiterated to me, especially how interconnected we all are. How you were saying, Joy, that the world
It's closer.
is closer, is smaller. We're all connected more now. So that's my main takeaway from this.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. And also thank you to Dr. Jim Ginther for joining us. If you would like to know more about any of our programs, of course, you can always check our website, the EisenhowerLibrary.gov, also K-State.
Well, it's the College of Agriculture. It's where you'll find a lot of this. Global Food is actually a small program that is just growing. So if you get to the College of Agriculture website at K-State, all our extension programs are there, and from there you can connect to all our innovation labs and connect to all the great work that researchers are doing around the world through that, and of course the Global Food Program.
All right. And then as well as
the Robert J. Dole Institute of Politics.
All right. I didn't want to say the wrong thing.
No, that's all right.
All of our websites, you can check this out. You can check it out. You can find some of our documents. You can find information about the Global Food Program. And so we welcome you to do the research. And so we've had some great quotes today. We opened with a snippet from Senator Congressman Dole and Congressman Hope. And we're going to close with some words from President Eisenhower, a speech that he was giving in India that kind of sums up the Food for Peace program. So thank you all.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
In a world marked too often by fears and distrust, it warms my heart to take part in an event which is the product of mutual respect and ever-growing friendship. When I was in your country last December, I caught the spirit of progress that abounds in the new India.